Hello and welcome to the David Kurten Show. I'm David Kurten here on today's News Talk TNT. Now, we need to talk about free speech because free speech is under attack, as I'm sure you know, not just from the cultural Marxist left, if you like, but also unwittingly at the moment from the free speech right and people who have advocated for free speech and freedom up to now. There is a trap being laid and people are being baited to fall into it. Let's just go back a little bit in history and look at where free speech comes from in the West, because free speech is not something that everybody has enjoyed through all of history. And it's not something that people enjoy all around the world. If you suffer under the Chinese Communist Party or severe Islamic regimes, you don't have freedom of speech. But in the West, it's generally assumed that it is a condition of living and we take it for granted. But we shouldn't do. And it hasn't come from nowhere and it has been hard fought for. In England, we are especially blessed because we had the glorious revolution of 1688. That put an end to 150 years of Catholics and Protestants fighting each other, where one side would gain the throne and they would curtail the free speech of the other side, put them in prison, sometimes kill them. And then the other side came to the throne and they'd do the same to their enemies, if you like. The Toleration Act that came out of the Glorious Revolution in 1689 put an end to that. And it said it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or Protestant or nonconformist or non-religious at all. You have complete freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and freedom of expression. It is not the job of the state to regulate what you can say and to curtail what you say. That consensus has held up to now to some extent, but certainly up to the 1960s, completely unchallenged. The thing is that this was in a culture in England which was deeply and profoundly Christian. And so most people had the same values and the same general principles, even if they might differ on religious beliefs and so on. Now, in the 1960s, there was a cultural revolution in the West, as I'm sure you know. There was profound social change. What was quite famous about the 60s were the student protests and riots in some cases in 1968. They spread around the world and students agitated for change as part of what was called the New Left. They held up placards celebrating and lionizing the three ideological heroes of the 1960s Western cultural revolution: Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. Now, most of you, in fact, all of you, I imagine, have heard of Marx and have heard of Mao, but you probably never heard of Herbert Marcuse. He was a professor and ideologue of the Frankfurt School, notorious for inventing and developing cultural Marxism. In 1965, he wrote an essay which was called Repressive Tolerance. And the thesis of that essay was that Western society, which was Christian or conservative or traditional, was tolerant only of its own principles, but repressive to anyone else, particularly the ideas and the new liberalism that the new left wanted to bring in. So he suggested two things: that this repressive tolerance needed to be inverted so that there would be tolerance of left-wing ideas and certain kind of things which until then were considered degenerate. And then those people who had the upper hand up until the Cultural Revolution needed to be repressed. So what happened in the New Left in the 60s with the Cultural Revolution? There was all kind of free speech advocating for things that beforehand were considered wrong, if not wicked, such as pornography, promiscuity, pedophilia, liberation of homosexuality, abortion, divorce liberation, the proliferation of drugs and gambling, and so on. All of these things, to my mind and to many minds, are degenerate. You may disagree, but you have the freedom of speech to do so. Those were brought in, and the people on the New Left had the upper hand culturally and socially and brought them in. And then later on, introduced repressive measures, either laws or social conditioning in order to shut people up and silence people. So if you disagreed with some of those things, you're called a homophobe or a transphobe or a misogynist. There's all kinds of hate laws which have been brought in to curtail people's freedom of speech. After then, there was a counter move by mostly people on the right advocating for free speech in order to be able to say things that they said before, traditional values, Christian values, conservative principles, which were suppressed by the repression of Marcuse's repressive tolerance. Then the right, if you like, the freedom movement stood up and said, we want free speech to be able to say what we want to say. And the mantle of free speech very much passed from the left, the new left, over to the right and to the freedom movement. But today there is a trap being baited, and this follows on particularly in the United Kingdom from the events in Parliament last week, where there is now a narrative that there is Islamism in the UK, which is anti-Semitic. And a lot of people are agitating now, who were previously for freedom of speech, against the right of people to go on the streets and call for a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. Those marches are being labeled as hate marches. And people, disturbingly, on the right or in the freedom movement to some extent, are mirroring the very strategies of the new left in calling people names, anti-Semitic, homophobic, etc., and calling them hateful in order to try to cancel and curtail the freedom of speech of people who want to go out and protest against what's happening in Gaza. Now, I am not getting involved personally in any of these marches. As I've said many times, I'm not pro-Israel, I'm not pro-Palestine, but I have called for a ceasefire because I don't want people to continue to be slaughtered in what's happening in the Middle East. But I think we have to be very, very careful in not mirroring the language of the new left in smearing these marches as hate marches and saying that if you go on one, you are a Hamas supporting terror supporter. Because if you do that, you're falling into the trap of agitating against free speech. It's very difficult, I know, because these things are generating high emotions. But we need to think clearly about what's going on here and continue to support free speech, both in the UK and around the world, even if it's for things that we don't support and we think that some people may find offensive. That is what we've always said, and that's what we need to continue to do. This is today's News Talk, TNT.